Hello and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime Archaeology program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Today's topic is training the next generation of preservationists by processing colonial artifact collections. And with us is Dr. Jonathan Burns. Dr. Burns is the director of the Cultural Resource Institute, a research platform for historic preservation projects and student training at Juniata College. He is currently involved in archaeological fieldwork and historic research at several French and Indian War fortifications in Pennsylvania, dating between 1755 and 1758. His ongoing research of prehistoric sites on the eastern shore of Maryland and in the Juniata River Basin provides opportunities for students to obtain valuable hands-on training and conduct independent research. Welcome, Dr. Burns, and thank you for presenting today's program.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining this online talk sponsored by the State Museum for Archaeology Month. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share with you some of the details of the artifact curation process, hopefully demonstrating how the activities of archaeology that begin in the field continue on in the laboratory. I'm primarily going to focus on the process of curating the artifact collections that are produced by our active field program at Juniata College. As an archaeologist at our liberal arts college in Huntington, Pennsylvania, I have the honor of teaching at least part of the next generation of archaeologists and historic preservation practitioners. Basically, I involve undergraduates in real-world historic preservation projects so that they might potentially find a career path that intersects with these skills as well as their interests and passions. At Juniata, I direct the activities of the Cultural Resource Institute, an educational platform to support undergraduate student training and research. I believe that the undergraduate level is where students can be most inspired to take this pathway, continuing then to graduate programs with a strong foundational knowledge and experience. Deep in the Ridge and Valley section of the state, Juniata provides a geographically convenient place from which to study the history of the archaeology and the archaeology of the colonial Pennsylvania frontier. It's all around us and accessible for study. Here you can see the college logo and a red circle roughly delimiting the 18th century colonial frontier where we conduct research. Currently, there are multiple collections being studied in the CRI laboratory, mostly dating to the French and Indian War and some associated with the American Revolutionary War. You can see the top three sites on the list are all closely related in time and geography: Ports Shirley, Littleton, and Halifax. All were constructed within a few months of one another between the fall of 1755 and the spring of 1756. And I've had the opportunity to conduct extensive fieldwork at all three sites, providing a broader regional view of these individual fortifications. Looking at Hunter's 1960 map of the frontier forts of Pennsylvania, you'll see that these three forts are way out on the frontier, or rather what would have been the frontier between 1753 and 1758. The squares identify Pennsylvania forts, while the V's and fleur-de-lis mark the locations of the Virginian and French fortifications, respectively. You'll notice that much of the remaining modern-day state is occupied by Native American villages, a political pressure cooker for sure. The Fort Shirley site, located in Shirleysburg, Pennsylvania, is an absolute gem of an archaeological site, and where I directed the Penn State University Archaeology Field School for 4 seasons between 2010 and 2013, producing an extensive look into this unique site. First known as George Crowan's Alwick Plantation and then fortified in the fall of 1755 in response to Braddock's defeat and the threat of war on the frontier. It's almost a one-of-a-kind site because of its history and its associated historical figures. It was George Crowan's plantation and trading post that attracted the Mingo Seneca, who were displaced by the French when they built Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. These were the only Native Americans that wanted to assist colonial Pennsylvania to defeat the French. So it's a pretty unique spot on the landscape. And here we can see not only a historical map on the right-hand side, but in the middle, you can see the results of our archaeological testing, shovel testing, test pits, and coming up with an activity area and an understanding of this archaeological site that we cannot get from the written record alone. For example, the Fort Shirley site produced the largest and most diverse collection of copper ornaments, glass trade beads, and other items of personal adornment like buttons and fasteners in the county. These not only chronicle the experiences of the colonists, but also those of Native American communities caught up in the political unrest. Here you can see the direct material evidence of their presence on site, which is also historically documented, but not in this vivid detail. And therein lies the beauty in historical archaeology. It contributes more to what we sort of know from history, but by weaving a tapestry of details on the threads of history. It's an exciting and even addicting endeavor. I'm kind of the Pied Piper for recovering this material culture and understanding its historic context. More recently, I've had the opportunity to position our Juniata College field schools at Fort Halifax, located 18 miles north of Harrisburg on the east bank of the Susquehanna River. A sister fort to Fort Shirley, meaning the timing and conditions of occupation were quite similar. And the modern consequences are such that these forts are largely undisturbed and there for study. Both of these forts were early fortifications on Benjamin Franklin's so-called outer ring of frontier forts. These were designed to protect the southeastern region of the state, including the colonial hubs of Lancaster and Philadelphia. Both forts were occupied by the Pennsylvania Regiment in 1756. So it's really fun to chase the material culture across the frontier and looking at the differences and even the similarities in that material culture. Both places served as sites of Native American council as they debated their options amidst the turmoil brought on by the contest for Western Pennsylvania between Great Britain and France. The archaeology at this site is very similar to that of Fort Shirley, in the distributions of small artifacts that help to tell the story in these short-lived fortifications. The fact that these forts were occupied for little more than a year means that the archaeological resolution of the occupation is very high. In other words, we can learn a lot from the distributions of artifacts and features that were not extensively chronicled in the written record, but through archaeology. From the archives, we do have a handful of wonderful letters written from Fort Halifax, providing snapshots of activities and concerns of the occupants of the fort. Sometimes we even find direct validation in the archaeological record. So here's what it looks like in the CRI lab on campus right now. This is where students get to participate in the interpretation of new data, helping to illuminate material details about the past for the public and for posterity. In other words, turning chaotic trays full of dirty artifacts into informative scientific data and a curated collection destined for a museum. Just a few of the big picture things that we accomplish in the lab on campus. We preserve and interpret artifacts. The next time someone handles these items, it will be with white gloves. This is the pre-treatment that all curated artifacts have to go through, essentially. We also process collections for curation in museums. That's our primary function, is to get these artifacts into a curated state where they can help tell the story into perpetuity. Our work provides new insights into the past through the interpretation of material culture. Again, we have the wonderful written historic record, and this is enhancing our understanding. And importantly, in an educational setting, students learn valuable occupational skills and leave with a deeper appreciation for historic preservation. Some even go into historic preservation career pathways, which really warms my heart. But here you can see the process in action. The lab is the space where we clean, sort, photograph, 3D scan, package, and create the data, right? That is taking the chaos of excavated archaeological materials, where not everything is not everything is equal there. We have lots and bits of pieces of little things that most folks wouldn't understand why we would keep them, but they're meaningful if we collect them in a systematic way. What Maddie is doing is turning dirty artifacts from the field into coded and individually packaged data points that will allow us to accurately interpret the site and to even know what was there, what we recovered on such large excavations. You see that every classed artifact is cleaned, identified, sorted, coded, counted, and weighed. A very time-consuming endeavor. But we're consistent in our collection of mundane items like brick, nails, slag, and bone, as you never know what might be pertinent to the analysis and the interpretation of the site. Here you see another student. This is Sam. He's examining a brass spur that we recovered from Westmoreland County. He's pursuing his interest in military weaponry and, most importantly, being inspired by the hands-on nature of archaeology. These students aren't all archaeology students. In fact, most of them are not. Many are history students, some are geology students, some are biology students, but they're all participating in this process of historic preservation. And some of them get the bug and actually figure out how to work it into a career pathway. Sam's very interested in armaments and lead balls and firearm parts, and we have no shortage of those. Each lead musket ball tells a story, from its spatial location on the archaeological site, its use life history, from manufacture to loss, and even where it was mined. Through its isotopic signature, we can actually pinpoint its source. Pictured here are 4 musket balls from Fort Halifax with variable details. The first is evidence of a miscast ball, and the second is pitted from being chewed by a pig. The remaining 2 have been trimmed and ready for use. Being a malleable metal, a fired round typically becomes deformed from impact, and we can even sometimes determine what they struck. Lead is also a prime candidate for geochemical sourcing through the analysis of lead isotopes. Here I am scratching a small amount of lead from a batch of archaeologically recovered ammunition from a battlefield. Then my colleague in the geology department, Dr. Ryan Mather, measures the concentrations and the isotopic signatures to help us determine where the lead was mined. Thanks to him, now we have our own ICP instruments on campus, and we can actually do this testing, and we involve our students in the process. What's the value of this analysis? Well, Dr. Mather specializes in identifying materials like lead and copper from archaeological contexts from around the world. So he's very familiar with isotopic fingerprints of most, if not all, sources. This allows us to discern lead that was mined in England from lead that was mined in New France, and even to identify the earliest colonial sources in Sinking Valley at Fort Roberdeau in Blair County. As we are doing battlefield archaeology, this is meaningful with respect to mapping firing lines, where projectiles are both impacting and being dropped and lost in the heat of action. In some case, it matters to the analysis whether the source came from the Midland United States, which would be like Missouri sources and Illinois sources, and would suggest French mines that were active as early as 1720s. Or the standard lead that you might expect coming from England and France. And then we even have this local source, North American source of lead in the Sinking Valley. Moving away from lead artifacts, we can focus on buttons made of copper and various alloys during the mid-18th century. From these, we are learning more about the identity of the officers and soldiers of the Pennsylvania Regiment between 1756 and 1757 through items of personal adornment like buttons, buckles, and other accessories that convey status or ethnicity. The British didn't start marking their buttons with regimental inscriptions until the 1760s, so many of these early sites have a very diverse array of material culture and personal adornment items like buttons. We know that the Augustan regiment was comprised of a mix of colonists from both the countryside as well as larger towns like Philadelphia. In 1756, they were not well equipped like the British Army, which would have been outfitted with its uniforms and standardized weaponry. Rather, they brought with them civilian items of adornment and firearms with them to these remote and dangerous outposts. Here we can see the variability in these buttons, not just in their size, shape, and details of construction, but also in the status indicators of decoration. Buttons project identity, just as some items of personal adornment can convey ethnicity in the archaeological record, like with the copper ornaments that we recovered at Fort Shirley. But taking a look at these, you can see many different construction methods, and buttons were changing quickly during the mid-18th century. They were experimenting with new materials and new alloys, and also always pushing the envelope with trying to make it a stronger attachment to the clothing. Clothing would always pop off, so they were continuously trying to refine their ability to keep that button together and to be durable. So they changed quickly and are pretty good time indicators for us. A comparative approach can then be used when viewing this group of buttons from the Fort Shirley site. Since they were occupied under similar circumstances, patterns begin to emerge that illuminate the experiences of these soldiers and the camp followers that would have been there. Officers are chronicling some of the important things that happen in letters, but not everything is recorded in history. Here's a museum quality gas back or three-piece button recovered from one of the internal structures of Fort Halifax. This particular style button does indicate or suggest a military uniformity and was likely from an officer's coat. Lots of buttons and fasteners on the clothing in the mid-18th century that are lost and become incorporated into various features and activity areas that help us tell time and help us to know that we're actually on the site that we think we're on. Here we are learning about the meals and provisions of the Augusta Regiment from their dietary refuse left behind at Fort Halifax. Fort Halifax was constructed as a supply depot for the larger construction of Fort Augusta, meaning it wasn't going to be a permanent site. And that's good for archaeology because we have about 14 months of archaeological footprint, and then the site was deemed no longer to be useful and that it should be destroyed or razed to the ground, right? No traces of it left. And for a large, substantial fortification such as this, there's really no way to erase its existence completely, at least from archaeologists. So we've had the pleasure of chasing the proper artifact concentrations around this site, but also locating features like refuse pits and other cooking features that are giving us these rare glimpses of items that are over 250 years old, 268 years old. This well-preserved ham bone was recovered from one of the structures indicated on Joseph Shippen's map of the fort. Found deep below some historic fill and just out of the weathering zone. It's in great shape, for being that old. And again, this is material that could either go away or be stewarded and interpreted. And luckily, we grabbed this piece and were able to usher it through the preservation process. We're also learning about their recreational activities. Here you can see a horse scapula from which a bone die, complete with the count marks, was fashioned, then discarded in a demolished hearth in the soldiers' barracks. One of these historic letters that I mentioned does talk about a horse that was to be returned to its rightful owner downriver. Perhaps it never made it there. Another initiative in the CRI laboratory is 3D scanning and printing of diagnostic and delicate artifacts. Really the artifacts that help us tell time and the ones that are in danger of falling apart. Artifacts are sort of in stasis when they're in the ground, and as soon as we remove them from their archaeological matrix, the timer begins. Some materials are very stable, and others, like iron, are not. These artifacts in the picture are all from either the Fort Shirley site or the Fort Littleton site, featuring an array of diverse artifacts related to weaponry, adornment, transportation, and recreation. This is where I see great potential to put artifacts into the hands of K through 12 students, even democratizing the process to the point of school districts being able to print their own models for classroom instruction. We have a team of students working together and going to take it to an educational conference in February about this idea, how to create an archaeology site experience in a box or in a classroom. So a lot of that involves 3D printing, 3D scanning. In addition to the educational potential, the preservation utility of 3D scanning can be demonstrated in this comparison of a printed model of a wagon strake nail and the original iron artifact that was scanned over 8 years ago. You can see that because it is made of iron, it's unstable and it will continue to deteriorate and crumble. The 3D scan preserves its dimensions and attributes before that information is lost to the process of atmospheric corrosion. As I begin to wrap up this lunchtime lecture, I'll tell you about one more project that's exciting for me and for my students. A while back, I was contacted by the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks to conduct archaeology around a stone structure known as the Hessian Powder Magazine and affectionately labeled Building Number 38 on the base. This work was part of a larger historic structures report by the National Park Service. The project scope for us was to conduct a geophysical survey with one of our partners using ground penetrating radar, and then just to investigate those anomalies. Another great field school opportunity, this time testing the theory that this is the historic stone magazine built in 1777 for the Continental Army, which would make it the oldest US military structure in existence. So here you see students at that back door that's pictured in that historic photograph. And in that historic photograph from 1899, you can see that there's an overshot porch with some enclosed shelters on each corner. By then, this building had been converted from a powder magazine from the Revolutionary era to a base guardhouse up through and to the beginning of the Civil War, essentially. This was the cavalry's headquarters. So the building was adapted. Archaeology is necessary to evaluate the architecture of the building because much of the crucial information is actually below ground. So we worked alongside National Park Service architectural team members, which was also very instructive for me and my students, as they were dying to see the clues underground that would help them really put this together with an interpretation that is accurate and withstood every scientific test. Artifacts provide physical evidence of when it was built and modified. By decoding their distribution around the structure, we get a vivid picture that enhances what we know about the structure from history. There's always more to know, and archaeology provides that hard data. Now, these next two slides have very little to do with me, but rather are the direct result of a gifted undergraduate student taking the ball and running with it, and then spiking it in the end zone, as far as I'm concerned. I gave my spatial data from the project to this student who was skilled in 3D modeling, and he returned with this animation within a day of what he said, playing around. It's a 3D animated model of the initial construction of the Hessian Powder Magazine, illustrating buttresses that were only visible underground, and even the dismantling of the buttresses when the structure was converted to a guardhouse just prior to the US Civil War. This model will continue to be refined until it's scaled as accurately as possible. and it could even exist as part of the site's official interpretation. Not too shabby for just playing around. Once we did the archaeology, it became evident that we were looking at a Vauban-style powder magazine, complete with buttresses. When I told Luke that the buttresses were structural and meant to contain any accidental explosion by directing all the force and debris through the roof, he just had to do this. Right? This hopefully shows that historic preservation can excite liberal arts students in very different ways, many of which benefit our interpretation and preservation efforts. All of this goes into shaping the next generation's participation in historic preservation. It's heartwarming that I can give them a bit of guidance, show them where they can help, and then give them enough space to blow things up. Thank you so much for your interest and for listening, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was terrific. So let's get to some questions. What other scientific specialists do archaeologists like you work with?
Wow, that's a good one. We oftentimes work with geophysicists and geochemists, in my case, with the isotopic testing. But geophysics is also a specialized part of the field, and it's used by archaeologists, but other folks too. Being able to see into the subsurface with some confidence, or to see if there are what we call anomalies that are worth investigating or checking out. So geophysics is a really is a big help going into a site, and it kind of helps you form the rest of your research questions once you see some of that data, once you see what can be potentially sensed without digging, and using various technologies like magnetometers, ground penetrating radar, etc. Other folks that we work with would be faunal specialists, or if I find a lot of seeds or carbonized plant remains. Archaeologists don't necessarily specialize in everything. So what we do well is network with one another, and we and some folks that have these skills will farm out their services essentially. So it's very helpful to know, some hard science and not just be necessarily on a track that you want to be a raw archaeologist. I always tell our students that, hey, if you're into chemistry, if you're into biology, stay on those tracks too. But we can figure out ways to lace that into a preservation pathway where you could actually contribute.
You gave examples of using 3D printing. What other modern technology is being used in archaeology today?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, those the remote sensing capabilities of GPR sleds and but also drones and LiDAR technologies have really expanded our potential to be able to again save some time and not just go into a site completely blind, be able to fly over a site and look for slight changes in vegetation that we can see just with the normal spectrum of light, but we can also use infrared and, like I said, LiDAR, which is a sideways looking, very detailed type of radar and light imaging to get an understanding of past landscapes and how they've changed over time. Archaeological sites are not static. They're decaying and they're also under threat. So everything that we can throw at it with respect to technology is very important moving forward. A lot of our survey equipment, GPS, and also total station, like laser total station mapping, that stuff, that technology continues to get better. And archaeologists are always, we always need to keep up with that and to continue to try to utilize all of the tools in the toolkit.
What is the most unique item that you have recovered?
I get asked that sometimes. That's an interesting question. Some of the neatest things I've found have been entire fortifications, right? So like the Fort Shirley site and the Fort Halifax sites were very rewarding to find as this group of artifacts and features. But I would say one of the most important artifacts that we recovered at the Fort Shirley site would be this tiny copper charm with an Arabic inscription on it saying "No God but God." And this is from George Crowan's trading post before it was the Fort Shirley site, before it became fortified. And that small piece of material culture is actually, it's like as if we would have found a crucifix on a site, with a rosary, we would say, oh, there was a Catholic on site here. But finding this very small Muslim charm way out on the frontier is very unique. And the fact that we found that during an undergraduate field school is amazing enough. The thing is smaller than my pinky nail, but it caused such a stir and is potentially so informative that it's on loan to the Museum of the American Revolution. You can actually go see their display on religious items in the colonial era. And there's not a lot of material evidence left behind of Muslims in colonial America. So one little tiny piece like this is representative of that and can kind of open up the conversation about that.
Along the same lines, what is the most common item that you recover?
Nails, probably. When we do a lot of metal detector survey, doing conflict archaeology, we do battlefield survey. We also do those around fortifications too. But nails from all eras are frequently recovered. And the only ones that really make us excited in this context would be a hand wrought nail. So finding lots of cut nails and wire nails is sort of a running joke for most people once they get the hang of being in the field long enough. But other little small items of like pulverized brick, we even track that across sites because the Fort Halifax site was intentionally demolished. But again, they didn't clean it up completely. But we're looking at a fragmented record for sure. And all those little bits and clues help us.
So where have some of the students in the program gone on to work, or what sites have they worked on?
Many of them go on to grad school and then get involved in sort of like the pet field site of whatever grad school they happen to go to. Some of my students have gone on to do archaeology and programs in like Bolivia. The field is where you hook them, the field school and working in the lab. And if they continue down that pathway, it's really great to see where they wind up, how they grow. One student who was on one of my earliest field schools at Fort Shirley, I see is helping to direct and interpret excavations in search of camp security, right? Another Revolutionary War era site here in the state. So that really, that warms my heart when I see them going out and getting jobs either at museums, at the State Museum, or at a firm an architectural firm where they're doing environmental archaeology, impact studies. That's all very rewarding for sure. And I'd like to stay in touch with them.
Are there any fort sites that have not been found yet that you are looking for?
That's a good question too. I'm sure they are out there. There are none in my sites currently, since we found pretty good evidence for a small Revolutionary War site outside of Huntington here in the county where Juniata is located, called Fort Hartsock. We have Fort Roberdeau up here, and then Fort Hartsock would have been another, what would have been kind of a settler fort. So I know that there are several of those around in the county that we can kind of track or find clues about in the written record. But at this point, not necessarily targeting those because I have a lot of other fun projects that I need to catch up on and to see through. But I'm always, always have my eyes peeled for the potential to do some more research. The one thing that is sort of difficult to mitigate is the fact that this stuff is really interesting to a lot of people and that aren't necessarily archaeologists, and pastimes and hobbies have developed around, metal detecting and collecting and those sorts of things, especially on really unique, high profile sites that are really relevant that we can learn a lot about. those tend to, they're publicly known, and they're at risk from that kind of hobby collecting, unfortunately.
Where has your research been published for those who are interested in reading more?
Some of the work on, right now we're still writing up the Fort Halifax site, but some of the work on Fort Shirley has been in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, a couple articles on Fort Shirley specifically, and on ethnicity, and taking a look at those artifacts. We are currently in this lab writing up and reporting on 3 seasons rather of excavation at Fort Halifax, and all the while using the Fort Shirley site as a comparative collection, because like I said, they really date to almost the exact same time period. So working through both of these collections together is going to hopefully set us up to be able to write a work that includes both of them as a comparative kind of report. That's my goal anyway.
Is there a way for the general public to get involved with the program?
Let's see. So public archaeology, or archaeology that's front-facing and or sometimes called community archaeology programs, are becoming much more available to folks. I would encourage people to follow the Facebook pages of the Society for Pennsylvania Archaeology and the various chapters that might be located in your region. And as archaeology is seen more and more as a potential, as potentially helping with community development, and just kind of getting more and more people involved, we're gonna continue to encourage folks to realize why this is so important, and then how you can actually get involved. As a public citizen, going out and doing things by yourself is not as helpful as trying to find a local group who's doing sort of a sanctioned dig and learn the ropes of data creation and sort of artifact identification within that kind of setting where it's going to be interpreted for the public.
Thank you to everyone for your questions. Dr. Burns, what would you like the audience to remember from today's presentation?
I would say, that number one, that cultural resources like these artifacts are finite, right? And they need to be protected. Archaeological sites are fragile, and they need to be protected and stewarded. And then I guess the second thing I would say, a take-home message, would be the time to get excited about a career in archaeology and historic preservation is at the undergraduate level. I can't emphasize that enough, and that it's really great to see students light up, again, that might not necessarily have come to Juniata thinking that they were going to get involved in this, but then having these eye-opening and very experiential experiences. So if any students are out there, any folks are going to encourage students to go down this pathway, it's a possibility, and it's fun, and there's a way to go about doing this.
Thank you so much for presenting today's program.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website at statemuseumpa.org for program information and to sign up.